Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I am Amy Witherden. With me I have Dr. Paul Simon Handy of the Institute for Security Studies to discuss what he calls the recurring myth of African unity. Dr. Handy, can you explain what Pan-Africanism is and how it originated?
There are many ways to define Pan-Africanism, but basically, to give a short definition, Pan-Africanism is both a philosophy, it's a concept, and also a social movement. A philosophy born out of the painful experience of slave trade, which actually where we can really situate the origins of Pan-Africanism, let's say at the end of the 18th century, and a movement out of these mobilization of slaves, actually standing against the really bad conditions in which the system were actually putting them. So out of this movement, out of these insurrections, a movement was born, actually, a kind of network to in the Americas, in Europe, and in Africa, actually, to stand against this slave trade. And the second phase of Pan-Africanism came out of the claim for independence. It's basically beginning of the 20th century. So as you see, it originates not in Africa, but in Europe and in the Americas. It's a Pan-Africanism against something.
So it's a reactive...
It's a reaction. It's basically, to say it in a critical way, we can say that it's a unionist reflex of the weak, basically.
Why do you say in your paper that Pan-Africanism is in deep crisis?
I consider that Pan-Africanism is in crisis because the philosophy and the movement haven't been able to reproduce themselves. They haven't been able to rejuvenate. The common enemy is gone, actually. There's no colonialism anymore in Africa. There's no superpower anymore colonizing Africans. Apartheid has been abolished, so Africa is actually free. And we can't operate with the same philosophy that used to be the kind of slogan for against colonialism and slave trade. Today, the common aim should be development, and not more conspiracy theories and these invisible enemy that so many people want to see.
Your description of the idea of African unity as a myth implies that it is unrealistic. Why do you think so?
I think not Pan-Africanism or African unity is not a myth as such, but a certain idea of African unity is a myth. Why? Because it's actually based on these old reflex of standing against a common enemy. It's a myth because it implies that Africa is black. The reality in Africa is actually quite complex. Africa is much more than just black. Africa is extremely diverse. Another, so these basing Pan-Africanism on the color of the skin is actually quite problematic, just to say it in a euphemistic way. And the other way of considering African unity as the creation of the United States of Africa, it's also one of those problematic of conceiving African unity. So, but we can see that these two tendencies, these two ways of considering African unity are the ones that are prevailing today. This is where I see the crisis, because I don't see what a government of African unity will solve as problems in Africa in terms of delivery that we cannot solve at a local level. And race and all kind of the sense of ethnic belonging should be actually revisited. I think to overcome the crisis, African unity should be based on issue of real integration and delivery. This is where Africans will actually identify themselves with the question of unity. This is how Pan-Africanism will cease to be an elitist concept and movement to be a peoples-driven movement.
You say in your paper that Pan-Africanism should be approached in a more practical way. How could the African approach to the idea be reorientated, and on what criteria should a realistic goal of African unity be based?
First of all, I think that the African Union, actually, in its short history, has done a lot in terms of reviving the idea of African unity, even though I think that the idea, or let's say the principle of consensus that's driving the African Union is wrong, because you can't reach consensus on every important question for 53 countries. It's impossible. So we have to revise the way decision making is made at the African Union. Another criteria, or another important factor to drive the African unity debate is actually to open it to academics. The African unity debate has to be embodied in African university, in African think tanks. Today, actually, the debate is driven by politicians, which is quite a problem, because politicians, unlike academics, have another agenda than really the issues that are at stake. The debate is actually more done, or is taking place more outside Africa than in Africa itself, because African universities, you don't see centers of excellences on African integration in African university. So why actually? Because African unity has never been an object of analysis, has never been considered as an object of analysis by Africans themselves, except those living in the diaspora. But you find centers of African integration in European and American universities. So I think unless African academics appropriate themselves the concept of African unity, the African integration, how it should go, and provide our policymakers actually with options. And we won't be able actually to go beyond the reflex, the unionist reflex I was referring to while defining Pan-Africanism. So my view of Pan-Africanism is a more dynamic view, a contradictory view. We should not be scared of contradiction. And today, for example, saying that the idea of African unity government is absurd is almost committing academic suicide, because it's politically incorrect to say it. But I think that unless we open ourselves to a contradicting debate, we won't be able to go beyond the post-colonial time that African people are expecting from the leaders.
Thank you, Dr. Handy.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Paul Simon Handy of the Institute for Security Studies discussing the potential for African unity.